started planning this, when we started planning this series nearly a year ago, we really had only the dimmest idea of what the world was going to look like now. And as longtime advocates, researchers, and legal service providers working alongside people who self-manage their abortions and people who support others who do so, we were actually some of the people in the world in the very best position to know. So reflecting on the original concept note for the series, I'm struck by the sweet naivete of the fact that we thought that the series was going to transpire over the course of April and May of 2022. So how wrong we were, and yet how stunningly on target to the current moment. So the thing that brings me, and what I hazard a guess brings all of my co-conveners to the topic of self-managed abortion, is that it represents the simple truth that people find ways to assert their dignity and exercise sovereignty over their bodies and their lives, irrespective of what the law or the state has to say about it. Abortion has been taking place since before there were laws about abortion, and indeed before there were laws at all, and it's going to continue to do so. Our task as people who are called to use our privilege, education, and training to serve human need is to ensure that people are safe when they make and realize these decisions. So whether that is safety from harm that comes from the use of dangerous or ineffective means to end a pregnancy, or safety from violence by the state and its law enforcement apparatus. For those of us who are in the United States, of course, that task has been made much more difficult by the Supreme Court's ruling last summer in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which has sent the nation into chaos and deepened the division between states that were already polarized by the lingering effects of the unfinished work of post-Civil War Reconstruction and the economic precarity wrought by rapid deindustrialization. So I'm here to tell you, as a provider directly working with people who self-manage their abortions, that however bad you think it is, it's much, much worse. Our work at If, When, How for nearly 8 years now has been focused on providing legal defense and transforming the legal landscape to ensure that people who self-manage their abortions can do so with dignity and without punishment. In 2018, we first unveiled the Repro Legal Helpline, which was the first helpline in the United States set up to provide legal advice and referrals to people who want to know about their rights and risks they may face related to self-managed abortions. It probably comes as no surprise to you that every time abortion is in the news, our helpline team sees a rapid uptick in calls. And we've now reached a pace where we're getting calls from people who are in physical or legal peril virtually every week. There are crisis after crisis. So now, seeing what I've seen in the last 7 months, I can't sit here and repeat to you the empty platitude that Roe was never enough, because the very people for whom Roe was not enough to guarantee access are the ones now who are facing the kinds of crises that its backstop was just enough to prevent before. So people fleeing hostile states pursued by law enforcement, people using dangerous means to end a pregnancy because they've heard on the news that abortion pills will be illegal with the ruling in the FDA case, people left to continue inevitable miscarriages until they show signs of sepsis because providers are too afraid to intervene. Even people who manage to find their way to international services like aid access will ship the pills direct to users in the United States and are able to safely abort, only to find themselves charged with felonies for doing so. So neither self-managed abortion nor a Supreme Court case is a panacea for any of these, but it's a dangerous illusion to act as though the law and the presence or the absence of rights that the state can't transgress doesn't make a material difference in the circumstances of people's lives. It certainly makes a difference. So what does the future hold? Our hypothesis on the research team at If, When, How is that we can understand the future by getting a good handle on the past and on the present. So in terms of criminal prosecutions of people who self-manage their abortions, the instances have followed precisely the patterns identified by my colleague Laura Huss in her preliminary findings on research looking at arrests from the year 2000 to 2020. People who suffer under the criminal legal system for self-managing abortions are those who are already pushed to the margins in our society. So that's people of color, people living in poverty, people experiencing intimate partner violence, immigrants, and people who are unable to access care earlier in their pregnancy, and largely people who lack systems of support. But we've also seen escalating attacks on those systems of support. So just this past week, within days of the conviction of abortion activist Justyna in Poland for helping a woman desperate to seek an abortion, but under the coercive control of her husband, A man in Texas sued 3 people he alleged helped his wife self-manage an abortion while she was trying to leave that marriage. He sued them for wrongful death and conspiracy, seeking $1 million from each of them. And whether or not this case is successful, it's going to lead to litigation and is calculated to use the power of discovery to seize all the information that the anti-abortion zealots behind the case can get about anyone who helps people in their pregnancies. The intent of these actions is to terrorize abortion seekers and everyone who supports them. And they've been facilitated by laws that create criminal and civil penalties for people who, quote, aid and abet abortions. But little do the proponents of these laws realize that those who aid and abet abortions are all of us. And our research into the criminal investigations for self-managed abortions, the people who are caught in the net are friends, sisters, mothers, and other loved ones. And as more people find themselves in situations where the law stands between them and the care they need, the more people are going to step up for their loved ones and find themselves in conflict with the law. My hope is that we will follow the example of Latin America, where mass mobilization and mass movements have shifted the law to make it fit human need, as opposed to the other way around. But I'm so excited to hear from our speakers today and to be in conversation with them, and so that we can understand what the future might hold with respect to self-managed abortion. So I'm going to pass to Lucía to introduce our speakers now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farah, for that amazing introduction to this, to the last webinar of this seminar series that we have been doing. As you said, rightly so, naively, we planned to do this in a much shorter time and then reality hit. But I think that is also a testament of like how important this topic is and how we have tried to adapt to the ever-changing circumstances of self-managed abortion. So today we have 2 fantastic colleagues doing great work on self-managed abortion. Firstly, I would like to introduce Abigail Aiken. Abigail is an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. So her research focuses on the impacts of laws and policies restricting access to abortion, including how and why people self-manage their own abortions outside of the formal healthcare setting. She is currently the lead investigator on Project SANA, a research project that examines self-managed abortion in the US. She frequently testifies on reproductive health issues and provided expert testimony to the Irish Parliament on the 2018 abortion referendum. She has consulted for the CDC, WHO, and UN on various reproductive policy issues. And then we also have my very dear friend, Kinga Jelinska. Kinga is a co-founder and executive director of Women Help Women. Women Help Women is a feminist nonprofit that runs a global online service providing counseling and access to abortion pills via post, works with more than 100 partners group worldwide on community interventions, and also changes the norms and discourse around self-managed abortion. Kinga comes from Poland, where we saw, as Farah was mentioning in this week, the trial against Justina and the result of that trial, and I hope Kinga can share a little bit more on that. But where abortion is not only, in Poland, abortion is not only restricted, but it's also very stigmatized. Kinga is also the co-founder of the Abortion Dream Team in Poland and the European feminist initiative Abortion Without Borders. So I am more than delighted to have all of you here in this call, and thank you to all of the participants that are also joining us. We're trying to make this a conversation. We want to hear your questions and have the opportunity to ask all of us that are here everything that you wanted to know about the future of self-managed abortion that we can answer in 1 hour. So I'm going to hand it over to Patty to start the questions.
Hello, and it's so wonderful to be here. We're together at Temple. Lucía came for a visit, so we're delighted to be sitting together. And again, to reiterate, this is a conversation. We will take questions in the Q&A function of Zoom after some preliminary questions for Abigail and Kinga. So look forward to hearing your questions as well, attendees. So I want to start with Abigail and just sort of an overview of your work. I know that you look at the effect of law and policy on self-managed abortion. Heidi and I had the privilege of commenting on one of your publications before Dobbs conference that to me was sort of a prediction of the future of self-managed abortion, looking at the relationship between restrictive laws and demand of abortion, abortion through a website. And so I wanted to just turn it over to you and talk about your research and some of your recent findings in the post-Dobbs era around the effect of law and policy on self-managed abortion.
Thank you. And thank you all so much for having me as part of this series. It's really been so enlightening and also in some ways uplifting to be part of this work. So really, to give you an overview, many of you I'm sure are familiar with Project Sana because we've been going now for almost 5 years. It's hard to believe that. And so we really took our inspiration from work we've been doing in Ireland and in the Irish context before we started to look more closely at the United States. And my colleagues, Dana Johnson and Kathleen Broussard, who are folks that I know y'all know in this community, have been working with me on this since the beginning in Ireland, and looking to other parts of the world where we see restrictive laws that have been in place for many, many years. Some of our findings might seem obvious, so they might seem like that's exactly what we would expect, but in some ways, that's why they're important, right? It seems as though the US, in some ways, you almost, if you've been like me and have lived in a country or have experienced a country where abortion has been unavailable or has been criminalized, you're seeing your life happen before your eyes again, and you're wondering, how can we possibly be making these mistakes? I think I wanted to say that that's why it's important that we have these results in the US context, even though they do mirror what we've seen in other parts of the world. So we began really looking at self-managed abortion through the aid access service. And that's not because it's the only way to self-manage. Of course, it's not. There are many ways someone could self-manage involving pills or not pills, and pills from many different sources. And the landscape looks a lot different than it did when we started Project Sana back in 2018. But we use it because it's a very unique and interesting source of data, because it is one of the only sources of self-managed abortion in the US where there are data on numbers of requests and on some information that people offer when they use the service, and follow-up information from people also, so we can get a sense of what the outcomes of abortions look like. So I want to sort of couch everything I'm going to say by saying this is a window on self-managed abortion. It is not by any means the entire universe of self-managed abortion that is happening in the US. But when we first started looking at requests to the service back in 2018, the first thing that was immediately apparent was that this was a US-wide phenomenon. Certainly, the majority of requests were coming from states that had the most restrictive landscapes. And this is to, I think, Farah's point at the beginning of our webinar, that even before the Dobbs situation, of course, there were many, many people for whom the right to choose an abortion was a very empty right, because there was no means to exercise that. So you could see in states that had layered and layered and layered state-level restrictions had the greatest majority of requests. We're thinking about places like Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, but Alabama. But even above and beyond that, requests were coming in from all over the United States for all kinds of reasons. And so we saw that correlation already with restrictive laws, but we were also seeing that cost, for example, was a factor that was affecting people US-wide, as we know, right? Hyde Amendment, insurance bans, and at that point, the necessity of going to a clinic in the absence of telehealth models within the formal healthcare setting. So this is a continuation of what we know about self-managed abortion, that it's been going on since there were people in any country in the world, but what it looks like now has changed, and that demand was there well before Dobbs. Then we began to look at what I would call policy shocks. And I call things policy shocks when a state or a country does something that dramatically changes the landscape. Even though the landscape is patchwork and already really, really dire for some people in terms of access, a policy shock is, for example, Senate Bill 8 in Texas, when it was the first state level ban at 6 weeks gestation. Or what happened during COVID, when Governor Abbott in Texas and governors of several other states declared abortion a non-essential medical procedure for the purposes of shutting down abortion in the state for as long as they could. Every time this happened, we tracked what happened to requests to the aid access service. We found pretty much the same story every time. When Texas and several other states used COVID as an excuse to ban abortion, we saw requests to the service double. When Texas enacted Senate Bill 8, we saw a long-term increase in requests at about triple the baseline level. And in the post-Dobbs period, from the decision to the end of 2022, we saw requests increase in all states, but particularly in states with total or near total abortion bans, where you were looking at 3 or 4 times the baseline rate. So we see every time there's a policy shock, every time there's a restriction, it could be a patchwork of restrictions, or it could be one major restriction, we see this increase. It's not surprising because, of course, none of these laws do anything to change people's need for abortion or change the fact that abortion is part of people's lives. What they do is change the locus of access, right, and where people are seeking care. So that's one big takeaway from our findings. But to add on to that, it's not just a story of lack of access. That's a lot of it. But at the same time, every time we've looked at this before, at the very beginning, before when in 2018, when aid access was just beginning, up until the present day, we've seen requests come from everywhere. And when you look at people's motivations, which they share oftentimes when they access the service, it's often barriers, but it's also often preferences. It's people that are saying, I see people getting abortion pills in other states through the formal healthcare setting. Now that the FDA has changed the REMS and mifepristone to allow abortion, medication abortion by telehealth. And I'm wondering what's different about my state, right? And the only thing what's different about me, and the only thing that is different, of course, is the state law that you're living under, this impediment of the legal system. And so oftentimes people are questioning that. They're asking, why do I have to go through all these barriers when someone living over there does not? What's up with this postcode lottery? And so the interesting unintended consequence of abortion bans, the ones we've seen post-Dobbs, and I say unintended from the perspective of people that have advanced those laws, is that they oftentimes shine a light on self-managed abortion. They actually increase conversations about self-managed abortion. They increase awareness of self-managed abortion because people are hearing a lot more about it. People are looking at the situation in other states. They're questioning why they don't have the same access as others, and they're finding self-managed abortion even when they are people, for example, that could travel out of state, or maybe they live in a state where there's no abortion ban, but there's also no telehealth model in place because of state laws. And they are going to services like aid access and many other services now too, online pharmacy sites, Las Libres, community groups, and they are saying, why don't I have the same right to exercise my autonomy and to use what I know to be a safe and effective way of ending my pregnancy? So I think the big picture that we're seeing so far is every time we see more restrictions, we see more people self-manage, and we see more people interested in self-management. And we also see more conversations happening, more people beginning to say, I want that comfort, I want that privacy, I want the same model that other people in other states have.
Great, thanks so much for that that overview and extensive overview. And I'm here taking notes. Policy shocks is a term I think is super useful at this time that I hadn't really thought about. I want to turn it over to Kinga now to continue the conversation. Abigail's kind of talked about the law and self-managed abortion and some of the surprising effects, including shining the light on self-managed abortion. Kinga, your work is all over the world, but also in Poland, where self-managed abortion activist Justina was just sentenced for helping in self-managed abortion. So I'd like you, similar question, to talk about what you've seen as the law's effect on self-managed abortion, both in Poland, but also from a comparative perspective.
Thank you very much, Patty. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I welcome you from Warsaw this time. Well, let me start from the obvious. I think if we talk about self-managed abortion, we are seeing that this practice renders the law much less relevant in any way, right? Because as long as you have access to abortion drugs and information, in a sense, you have more freedom. The pills, this thing, right? Look at it, small, it can travel, you can put it in the pocket, you can pass it along here, there, everywhere, as we say. And from this very opportunity, a lot of programs, feminist programs on self-managed abortion started, right? They started from this opportunity and necessity and emergency to provide help because it became much more possible to have a safe abortion also in countries with legal restrictions. And to be honest, I was looking a little bit through our emails and phone calls and social media, etc., to see how much people do ask about the law, right? And the truth for me mostly is that people don't start with the law. They start with how much blood there will be. What do I do if I'm bleeding too much? What kind of painkillers I take, right? All these kind of practicalities. And when they refer to the law, they almost and solely refer to it in aspect, how do I not get caught, right? How do I make sure that I am legally safe? But it almost never is a discussion about the law in its generality, or what are the restrictions. And in fact, I do want to say that it depends where you sit and where you are, because this law does not affect us the same in all contexts. It's usually those who are less privileged that suffer the most, and the legal risks are usually with those who have more vulnerable positions. Similarly, I think the many programs on self-managed abortion did not start from conceptualizing a legal loophole. So it didn't really start from, oh, okay, so freedom of information, so let's start to only provide information. In my opinion, lots of those interventions started and continue to start from sheer rage and reaction to injustice that the laws are bringing and the harms that laws are bringing. So somehow those simple pills and this technology seems to be very anti-law, very anti-law and order, very anti-medicalization, and in its essence, anti-control. It almost seems like, I was watching children lately who were trying to put square, in the simple games that you put square in a circle, and you have to like adjust this little elements. And I was thinking about it. It a little bit seems when we talk about legal paradigms and self-managed abortion that we are using kind of a different grammar, that it is discordant, right? So I don't know if it is anti-law and order, or is it maybe somewhere beyond it, that it doesn't even recognize it as a basic start and foundational points of the reference. So this would be like big, maybe a little bit metaphorical things that I would say about the relation between self-managed abortion and the law. But I do want to speak about Justina's case, because I completely agree with Farah that it's watching the past and observing the present that will let us predict and find solutions for the future. And just this week, we have seen the verdict in Justina's case. And I think there are a lot of comparisons that we globally can take from the case, also with the US, but with other countries. So let me give you a little bit of context. In Poland, practically all abortions are supported outside of the formal system of the state. The state does not provide. In 2021, the state reported 107 abortions. 107 is as many abortions as Abortion Without Borders, the network of feminist activists, provides in one day. So we do as many abortions a day as a state does in a whole year, which of course is pathetic and absurd. Also, in Poland, unlike, for example, in the US, doctors are not historically allies. In fact, the feminist movement is very much in harsh critique of what is happening within the medicine and medical practices, because doctors claim to have hands tied, especially in the last 2 years, and they quite honestly do not know modern abortion methods because they have never been taught those, because here in Poland for the last 30 years we have very, very restrictive abortion laws. And I would like to also echo what Abigail said, that each time that we see restriction or attempt of restricting further, and with a couple of examples, more than 2 years ago, Constitutional Court in Poland said that people with fetal malformations will not be able to have legal abortions in Poland anymore, which provoked a massive protest on the street. In fact, statistically, we are talking about 1,000 abortions that were provided back then by the state, and those 1,000 abortions are not provided anymore. So we're not talking about a big group of people, but it's symbolic impact and rage on the street was nothing but was not minor, was really, really, really big. And in Justina's case, what actually happened is that Justina in 2020 sent a pack of abortion pills by post, by registered mail, where you have to give, your address and your telephone number, etc., which of course is also lessons learned for all of us activists to be extremely careful with the mailing system that is surveilled. She sent it to the woman in need, an act that many of us has done lots of times, and an act that is completely normal because it's sisters helping sisters, colleagues helping colleagues, friends helping friends, mothers helping daughters, etc. And again, why did they get caught? They got caught because there was a figure of a third person who isn't friendly. And it is very often what we see within the self-managed abortion movement, that's exactly how things get down, right? In this case, it was a partner of a woman to whom she sent the pills, and she used to be in an abusive relationship, and the husband, to call it bluntly, basically called the cops on his own wife. The cops came, confiscated the pills, and started an investigation, which led to finding who sent the pills and putting charges to Justina. So Justina received 2 charges. One was on aiding and abetting an abortion, and the second one was about putting to distribution, so from pharmaceutical law, putting to distribution unauthorized drugs, because mifepristone is not registered in Poland. Now, what we have seen throughout the trial, which from the get-go was political, because we saw that the judge appointed to the trial, again, wink, wink to all of you who are in the United States, and when we talk about your judiciary, was appointed politically. And so the judge, of course, allows a major anti-abortion organization of lawyers to sit as a sort of a quasi-prosecutor in the courtroom to assist, right? Despite our lawyers, of course, saying that they have no right to be there, that there is no social value in having them present in the courtroom, etc. The judge keeps them. Then the prosecution office throughout the trial is coming all over again with new evidence. Of course, what is the new evidence? Are interviews with Justina, where she says, I continue to provide information. I continue to work as an activist. I continue to pick up the phone, right? So they are trying to expand the definition, or even the feeling, the social feeling about what is this aiding and abetting, from the actual sending of the pills, the pills that were never taken because they were confiscated, so this abortion never took place, to also provision of information. And just this Tuesday, yes, I'm losing days because there has been very little sleep lately and a lot of press. We have saw the verdict. So the verdict is that Justina is guilty of helping. This is exactly the framing that the judge used. She's guilty of helping, with arguments that it was a formal crime. In other words, that the fact that all the circumstantial evidence about violence and the fact that the pills were never taken do not matter, with to put it bluntly, quite disheartening and pretty awful argumentation around and lack of recognition of cycle of violence. And like, you could really see how patriarchal, how misogynist, and how anti-women the institution of the court and the prosecutor's office in Poland is. And interestingly, of course, the case receives a lot of support internationally. Justina is labeled a human rights defender, and she's not a doctor, right? Just like I am not a doctor. We are the trained, competent community providers, nowadays supported as providers of abortion, even in the recommendation of the WHO. But I want to say loudly what she has done, despite great political support from, for example, Western Europe, in sense, is not in sense, actually it's a crime everywhere, right? To provide abortion outside of the system, outside of the licenses of state, etc. So this is also quite interesting, you know, like this duality. There might not be a political appetite for criminalization of activists of abortion, for example, in Western Europe, but that doesn't mean that there are legal provisions that actually make it legal or decriminalized. And again, to Abigail's point, the case, if I have to see into anything that came out good out of it, it's publicity for self-managed abortion. So all throughout, we have seen the more restrictions happen, the more people are interested in pills, but they are also interested in helping. So it came to the point where of kind of civil disobedience, and at the press conference after the verdict, as activists with the MPs, the parliamentarians from Poland, we said, okay, so you know what we're gonna do? We're going to reenact the crime so you can see how absolutely absurdistic it is. The moment that I pass you along, Patty and Lucía, the pills, that's exactly the crime. It doesn't matter if you're pregnant. It doesn't matter what's my intention. It's this simple, most normal act of passing along that is being seen as criminal. So for now, I stop.
Yeah, I mean, it's just incredible. Like listening to both of you is just, I mean, there's so many areas in which we have to do, I mean, further work, further thinking, and it's incredible the challenges that people are facing, but it's also incredible the renewed energies and efforts that people are putting in ensuring that people have access to information, medicines, and so on, and are able to as Farah was saying, like make live with dignity and make decisions over their bodies. So, I mean, to say that there have been significant changes in the US, I feel it's like a big understatement. But also, I wanted to point out that we have also seen, and it feels really wonderful, a lot of call for international solidarity, a lot of openness from the US to listen to the experiences of activists around the world that have been doing this work for a long time in also legally restricted contexts. So there have been some more conversation across regions, which I think is something that we are all welcoming. So in this context of both restrictions and challenges, but also optimism, renew energy for work on this field, like how are you seeing the future of self-managed abortion in the US, Abigail?
So it's a huge question, and I'm going to try to contain my answer and not take up the whole rest of the time. But so a couple of things. I think first, I want to talk about the strategy that has been employed by those who support abortion bans and who have, had this very well organized, very vocal, if even minority opinion campaign to really try to end access to abortion in the US. And now I don't believe the folks in that campaign were thinking much about self-managed abortion until the reality of it asserted itself for them. It's never been the strategy. The strategy has always been to go after clinical providers, to try to shut down clinics, or to try to convince people away from clinics by putting them through all kinds of physical and emotional and financial burdens. And so now that there has been the Dobbs decision, we see medication abortion very much as the focus of the next sort of round of restrictive laws. But when it comes to self-managed abortion, there's several interesting things going on. And I think that one is that the folks putting these laws in place or trying to end the practice of self-managed abortion, and that is the goal, I think that's been quite publicly articulated, haven't factored in the resilience and the creativity and the desire for autonomy and the need for autonomy that people who self-manage their abortions have. And what I mean by that is that if you have ever self-managed, or if you know somebody or have been with somebody who has self-managed, unless you understand that, you don't understand perhaps the extent to which this cannot be stopped. It is not something where you're going to enact a bunch of laws and see this suddenly end. Self-managed abortion has always been part of the human experience. It always will be. And, to misquote the dude from Jurassic Park, people find a way. Right? There is just no way of oppressing people to that extent. You can't do it. You can try and you can oppress them. And goodness knows this country has oppressed and oppressed and oppressed. It's part of our history. It's part of our fabric. It's happening and it has happened. But you can't stop people at the end of the day from exercising their autonomy when it comes to their reproduction. You can make it very hard for them. And yes, for some people, there will be pregnancies that are not wanted, that people have to go through. There'll be births people have to endure when they do not want to give birth. There will be people forced into parenthood when they don't want to do that, which is awful. But at the same time, you will never stop everybody. It's not going to happen. You can't. The arc of history shows us that you cannot oppress people that way. It doesn't work. However, that won't stop folks trying. And I think the climate is becoming, to echo what Farah said at the beginning, increasingly chilling and increasingly scary, I think, in terms of how far attorneys general and prosecutors of malintent are willing to go to try to intimidate people and to scare people, not just those who would self-manage, but those around them. And there is a sense in which there's a shift in some of the rhetoric around the idea that, the anti-abortion or pro-life movement doesn't prosecute people. It doesn't hurt or try to criminalize women. This has been the rhetoric for a long time, and it would be a big departure from that sort of long-term claim to now start really putting laws on the line that say we're going to explicitly criminalize self-management. Of course, even in the absence of those laws, people are surveilled, harassed, and unjustly criminalized and prosecuted. But will we see an increase in that? That is something that remains to be seen. I think we will, and I think we are. But to what extent laws are going to begin to explicitly target people, that is something that I think everyone is watching right now. Even if that happens, self-managed abortion is not going to go away. Look at Ireland, look at Poland, to Kinga's points, look around the world, and you will see that people do this under circumstances of explicit and extreme criminalization every day in enormous numbers. And that, I think, is something that perhaps has not been fully reckoned with from the law and policy side in the US. The second thing is how self-managed abortion is accessed. And I think that your points about how the US is beginning to look further afield to see how is self-managed abortion provided and supported in other contexts, particularly the contexts in which medication abortion with misoprostol originated, and are taking their cues from a lot of the idea that you can do this through many models, right? Some of them may look more like online provision with a provider that's looking at a questionnaire. Some of it looks like community support. Some of it looks like a network of people all helping each other. All of those models are needed, and all of them are valid. And I think that when we think about the different ways in which people might access care, the more sort of points of access and the more different ways to meet people's personal needs, the better. Another thing I sort of wonder about and see perhaps is the blurring of a line between what we would call advanced provision of abortion pills and self-managed abortion. Now, advanced provision of pills, I think most people know, but just to clarify, it's the provision or the obtaining of abortion pills in the absence of pregnancy so that you can have them on hand whenever, if and when you might need to use them in the future. There are services that are already doing that, or somebody can go online and do that for themselves. They can request from a group like Las Libres, and they can get their pills and they can keep them for when they want to, or share them with somebody else. And when that becomes widespread, and I believe that it is already pretty widespread, and even in the absence of the US medical system and the formal healthcare setting getting on board with that yet, definitely people are starting to pay attention to it, but it's not something that's routinely done. The line between what it means to self-manage, to request self-management when you have an unwanted pregnancy versus just wanting to have those pills for your own autonomy, for your own peace of mind, for your own safety, perhaps, gets very blurred, right? And I wonder if in the future, the provision of self-managed abortion through, for example, the telemedicine model is going to really start to not see that line anymore. We're kind of a long way from that in the formal healthcare setting, but since that's already happening in the self-management world, I think we're going to increasingly see sort of hybrid models or models that engage clinicians in the US begin to sort of follow suit or begin to pay attention to that, which is to say, does it matter if somebody is already pregnant or not? Probably only if the person themselves thinks that it matters and wants some extra kind of help or support or counseling around that. Otherwise, we are already in a world where people see the need or have a wish to have abortion pills on hand, and they're finding many, many ways of being able to do that so they can be used at a time when necessary under the circumstances that person wishes. The last thing I'll say, I know I'm running out of time, but it will not be a panacea. I think that's been said already, but just to say, of course, there are people for whom this model of self-management or any model of self-management isn't going to be their desired model or isn't going to be the right model for them. And that may be because of the point in pregnancy that they're at. It may be because they really prefer a different way of having an abortion. They may want a procedural abortion and want to be in a clinic setting or want to be doing things a certain way. So I think seeing it as part of the spectrum and a very legitimate and now I think normalized part of the spectrum. For a long time in the US, we've talked about self-management as if it's some other thing over there that's not part of the spectrum of how people might wish to have their abortion in the US. That is changing. And now I think we're sort of seeing much more acceptance and much more of the idea of like, look, it's a continuum, it's a spectrum. There is never one way that's going to suit everybody. And so all options ideally would be on the table.
Thank you so much, Abigail, for that answer. It's it gave us a lot to reflect on. It allows me to connect very, very nicely with my question to Kinga about and you mentioned something in a speech a while ago about this multiverse of abortions, right? And the need to engage with this like variety spectrum of practices that Women Help Women as an organization, you yourself, but also the partners that you work with have piloted, finessed and improved and adapted and adjusted throughout years of doing this hard work, right? So I think based on that wealth of expertise and experience that you have, how does the future look like, or how is your vision for self-managed abortion? How are you envisioning?
Always intimidating, Lucía, to talk about the future. I think it's almost a privilege we don't have, and while we have to be really realistic and think long term, you know, after COVID and some of the crazy fiction things that happened lately, also in the abortion universe, it seems like a little bit of a futile exercise. And I also agree with what Farah said before, that it's sort of legal dystopian future is already happening, right? Look at the legal hotlines and the cases that we are seeing. I think all in all, the controversy will always remain the same, which is who owns abortion, right? It's really a matter about control and ownership. I also think that we will be seeing more cases like Justina, and they will be a catalyst for change because more people will know. So that's like, you know, the flip of the legal trouble. More people will know about the technology, and more people probably will want to even become helpers. And because what those cases do, they sort of prove beyond doubt that it's not about laws. It's about people, their experience, and their story. And I think, if anything, Justina's case exactly shows it. Like, what does it mean, be guilty of helping? What kind of statement is that, right? And again, to the ownership of abortion, I think we see this pathway of institutionalization of self-managed abortion through telemedicine, right? And telemedicine, which is medicine remotely with, you know, simplification, pragmaticism of it, etc., but paradigmatically not questioning the power relations, right? So it's still within the institution of medicine and all the which is hierarchical, which per definition often is not that progressive. And I think we will see this tension with the telemedicine providers, with a lot of activists saying, you know, where we need you the most actually is second and third trimester, because in the first trimester, well, it's absolutely not a panacea. We can manage by ourselves pretty damn well. Right, so it is very much related to the global discussion about when do we need abortions, and that we need abortions throughout the whole pregnancy. And then I guess the activist movement will push forward this indeed creative and anti-control agenda related to the change of power dynamics, right? That the PS should become so common, and the thinking around it, it's that exactly we have to kind of dissociate of this fetish of the law and see it like, hey, if I have flu, I go to the doctor or to seek additional help only if there is a complication. It doesn't cross my mind to call the doctor and say, hey, I want to report that I had a flu, right? Put it in the statistics. Nobody's thinking about it. And I guess in some societies and in some communities, we are going this direction, and we already are seeing this. And the focus will be on access. From the technological point of view, I think we will see many more programs that are focused only on misoprostol because of what is happening around mifepristone and how rigidly and ridiculously, absurdly over-regulated this medicine is, or that it will be taken out of the market, what we are fearing, of course, in the United States. And we will see also many more abortions, self-managed abortions in the second trimester, and in the third trimester, because of course the access to surgical and or institutionalized care in second and third trimester is also diminishing. And I do want to say it because I have been working self-managed abortion for 16 years. And let me be very blunt, maybe even will sound arrogant, but it is a hype. And it is a trendy topic for a couple of years, particularly when things started to, like access to abortion started to decrease also in the US, because obviously a lot of the global agenda is driven by what is happening in the US in many, many levels. So we are, and it of course warms my heart that everybody is talking about self-managed abortion, and that there is such a big consensus that this information should be, available everywhere, and people are putting a lot of efforts in it. But it's a lot of information and not so much access to the pills. Yeah, and I would even want to be a bit controversial here and say that there's a lot of facade and kind of frontage, as sort of a window dressing, a disguise to like create only this information related programs, as if those pills or medicines grow on trees. And I continue to ask among the us providers, activists, but also donors, how can we facilitate for access? Because I also see that this risk of provision in many communities unproportionately affects community providers who are in much more vulnerable position also legally. In other words, it's not for me very surprising that it was Justina who got caught and not a doctor in the community that I come from. And lastly, I also want to talk about the economics of it all and how can we disrupt some of the power structures related who owns the pills, quite literally. And I think what we will see in the future is that there will be more production and diverse production, probably owned by the feminist groups and community providers. Because I think it's also time to open up this discussion, why the access to pills is so difficult, why activists have to continue to travel, put pills in their bags, risk the physical safety, etc., and that we have to find more creative models now that we are all almost agreed that information should be provided as widely as possible. We will need to critically and creatively look at the avenues of access. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for all of that, Kinga and Abigail. I especially am kind of now hooked on the point of institutions not wanting to take on the risk around pills and then pushing all of that risk down to communities and individuals and family and people who are helping at the person-to-person level, taking on all the risk. I think that's brilliant. So I want to open it up to questions. I'm going to read one that it's a comment that's very, very relevant here. And if other people have questions, please do put it in the Q&A function in Zoom. And we probably only have time for a couple, but I do encourage people to ask questions of our panelists. And one point in the Q&A is the line between telemedicine and self-managed abortion is being further blurred by shield laws, such as shield laws that protect providers that are in abortion-friendly states from being subject to prosecution or extradition in abortion restrictive states. So that shield laws are blurring the line between telemedicine and self-managed abortion, passed in Massachusetts, moving forward in New York and Vermont. And this is where clinicians can use telemedicine to provide pills beyond state lines. And so clinicians having an opportunity to perhaps take on a little bit of legal risk, which is also being mitigated by shield laws somewhat, although there are questions around how those will all play out in courts as well. Another comment, a provider, and I know right now the existing organizations are saturated with providers and would love to see how more organizations open up. For my computer is a bit far away, so that's why I'm leaning into the screen. And then a question about to see more organizations open up. So a need for more organizations providing telemedicine with providers, but then also perhaps community groups and people who are not medical professionals providing information and pills, importantly. Can we dream of producing the pills ourselves to avoid some of the legal constraints derived from pills being a patent? So on Kinga's point that, yeah, producing the pills among feminist groups who are activists, how can we do that? And I think that misoprostol is not patented. So it would be interesting. I don't know if anyone's done a true exploration of how to open up our own pharmaceutical manufacturing plants in various places and looking at where that might be most feasible in the world. So I think what I'll do now, given those comments, a question about the dream of manufacturing pills, open it up to some final thoughts, first from Abigail and then from Kinga.
I wanted to express gratitude to Kinga and to all of you and Farah for all of the insights. I feel like every time I get together with folks from this community, I learn something else new. So I wanted to just put that and lift that up and say that even if you are someone, as many of you attendees are, who have been thinking about and working with self-managed abortion and people who self-manage for a long time, there's always something new to be learned. And I think that right now, looking to other contexts to see where we can be learning and what we can be doing is really key. The other thing, I think, I'll say this from a place of personal experience as well as just sort of a read on the climate right now. It's a really hard time sometimes not to feel intimidated, not to feel as though you're under a microscope or in crosshairs for the work that you might do or the research that you might do or the role that you might play in helping and being part of this community and this phenomenon that's happening right now. And I think that it is uplifting and strengthening to know that there are so many others out there who also care so much about this, and to know that this and we will persist.
Thank you. And I want to note too that we want to give some time for Heidi to have closing thoughts, but Kinga, a few thoughts, quick thoughts on some of the questions and comments, and then we'll turn it over to Heidi to close us out for the whole series.
On resilience that comes with self-managed abortion, you cannot stop it, as Abigail said. You cannot control it. We really have to let go of control on so many levels. Also, how scientifically we described abortion, what were our paradigms. It's all changing, right? It's all changing, from the names of who are the researchers to the practices themselves. It's unstoppable. You cannot account for all of it. We have to let go. We have to trust in this technology that it really is simple and effective and medically safe. And we see it all over again. And it makes access so much more equitable in many ways. That it becomes a story of resilience and a story of opportunity as well, as much as the story of oppressions which are coming from the apparatus of the state.
Thanks so much. Take it away, Heidi, to close us out.
Thank you all. Thank you, Kinga and Abigail, for being here. Today, as we've said, marks the end of our fourth and final panel in this series, The Law and Evidence on Self-Managed Abortion. But I think, as Kinga said so well, when it comes to self-managed abortion, people don't start with the law. It will not end with the law. I think there's been so much shared today about where we sit in this moment. In some ways, self-managed abortion awareness of it has grown in leaps and bounds. There are models proliferating, community groups around the world, providers and being involved in different ways. And as a researcher who studies the safety and effectiveness of self-managed abortion and the public health benefits of access to abortion, that is an incredible good. And yet we face this same twin sort of parallel arc of, I do think, a small group of people, but as you all have said, well-organized, vocal, that is becoming increasingly pernicious and creative, and in the ways they target the laws to isolate people and criminalize people who are seeking to support those having self-managed abortion, or, as you hinted, Abigail, we're seeing evolve in the US, maybe also beginning to target the pregnant person themselves. We've heard from each of you really clear and compelling, encouraging, frightening thoughts about what the future of self-managed abortion may look like. Calling for noting civil disobedience, pushing for legal reform, building trusted networks, challenging just the provision of information, as you've said, Kinga. Who is bearing the burden of providing access? What is the crime we're actually talking about here when it's handing someone pills or providing them information and support? So I just want to thank everyone for your contributions. And I know this is not the end of the conversation, obviously. So I hope that the things we've shared here, that all of us as panelists, as organizers, as attendees can continue these conversations out in the world. And I hope it's inspired and informed all of our efforts in the various lanes and cross-lane approaches that we take. So I want to thank my co-organizers, Adrian, Farah, Lucía, and Patty, as well as Hope and others for their support in hosting these sessions, to our institutions, Temple University, Georgetown, If, When, How, and Ibis Reproductive Health. And a huge thank you mostly to all of you, our panelists, the attendees, and everyone who has made these conversations so rich, timely, and informative. Thanks all.